Also, a very good evening, everybody, to coming to ESSEC Asia Pac at National Library Building. I'm Alan Lai, the moderator for tonight's session. I'm currently working for ESSEC Asia Pac as the Director of Health Economics and Management, Research Institute Health Economics and Management, Asia Pac. And together with me, we have our keynote speaker today, Professor Gérard Pouvourville, the Chair Professor of Health Systems in ESSEC in France, and also the Professor in Department of Economics. Actually, Gérard is the one who brings up this topic of risk sharing agreements. So everything starts from Gérard about this public talk. And this is the first inaugural talk of this public talk series, in which we term it is a Health Business Society public talk series. And this public talk series, we touch upon the critical issues, emerging, developing stories in this part of the world in three dimensions: health, business, and society. So in the following presentations, or even the following series talks, you will find this common theme running along the line. And today we are very glad that for the topic, risk sharing agreement between payers and health industries. We regard this as a very critical issues in this part of the world. So for this public talk, our supporting organization is American Chamber of Commerce and Access Health International. We have a major director from Access Health International. Adrian, where are you? Yeah. Thank you for supporting this event. And so this is our, the golden boys for tonight. We have Gérard Pouvourville from ESSEC, France, and George Poole, Vice President, Managing Director of ASEAN Medtronic, and the third one is Dr. Dhinagar Subramanian. His own consulting firm, if I pronounce this right, is CLAR. Yeah, CLAR Private Limited. Before he initiated CLAR, he actually had been working for Bio International, based in Singapore. And me, as a moderator for tonight. And I'd like to do a brief introduction of ESSEC Asia Pac. ESSEC, because some of you might not be very familiar with our school. Our school is a very old school, established in 1907. Just 1 year before Harvard Business School was established. So that means we are older than Harvard Business School. And over the past 100 years, we have accumulated more than 44,000 alumni working in every corner of the world in various industries. And for the time being, every year we receive around 4,400 students. Majority of them actually are in our two campuses in France. And some of them, around 900 of them will come to Singapore for their Asian tract. And we have established 157 partner universities to establish prestigious university in different regions. And ESSEC actually provides very comprehensive coverage of education program ranging from undergraduate BBA to Master of Science or MBA, Executive MBA, and also PhD. And we are very famous in our executive education programs. So these are the rankings that we have achieved for the past few years. That we have a number 2 ranking in the world for the master program, Advanced Master in Financial Techniques, and we ranked number 7 in the world for the executive education open rank. And for our flagship programs, Master of Science in Management, Go program in France, we ranked number 8 in the whole world. And we also get to establish accreditation from AICSB in 1997, since 1997, and at least European quality in training in business education since 2003. Another fact about ESSEC is that we are running 3 campuses in the whole world. 2 campuses are in France, one in La Défense. The major campus is in Cergy. It's about 40 minutes transportation time from Paris downtown. And the third campus is the only overseas campus other than France is Singapore. And by the end of this year, December 2014, we are going to have our new campus established. A whole new campus will be ready in January 2015, and it will be located in One North Biomedical Park in Singapore, Biopolis, around there. So, and then another point I'd like to mention is that ESSEC is the first European business school which has a very heavy focus in health. We have been doing health training healthcare executive, high-level healthcare executive for more than 25 years. And because of this, actually, Gérard is also one of the chair in the chair professor of health for health systems. We have another chair in another chair professor in therapeutic innovations, and two executive master programs actually provided in La Défense and France. One is strategy and management of health industries. The other one is modern hospital management, master of science program, specialized master. So this is the slide about our research institute in Asia Pacific. EHAM is in short, is the Institute of Health Economics and Management. So for the past 3 years, when we established in Singapore campus, we provided workshops in healthcare technology. So we have done 5 rounds already. 3 rounds in China, 2 rounds in Singapore. And the next round will be in Tokyo, partnership with Keio Business School. And we also provide the second type of short course executive education, which is economic evaluation for healthcare technologies. So you will have the brochure. I think some of you will get the brochure from the upcoming short courses provided in July, 1st of July to 5th of July, the 5-day intensive course from Tuesday to Saturday, provided in Singapore. And also we provide annual, as part of our value proposition to corporate sponsors for this research institute, we have annual forums. The first forum in 2012 in Singapore, and last year we have Health Forum in Shanghai, partnership with Fudan University School of Public Health. And next year we are going to have the third round of Health Forum in Tokyo, partnership with Keio Business School. And in ESSEC Asia-Pac, EHAM also ambitious to launch a new program based on science of health, management of health industries by December. I mean, actually, the first intake will be December 2014. So you will have chance. If you feel interested, please take one brochure with you. We have brochures in the front, and it's more details about the program. And this is a slide showing our academic partners and our corporate partners. So we have Medtronic, like George Poole is working for Medtronic as our sponsor, and other than Medtronic with Sanofi, AbbVie, Deerfield, Shire, Epson, UCB, Viper, and Johnson & Johnson. So now let's turn to today's topic. Before that, I just want to show you a little bit about our master programs management in health industries. The first intake will be December this year, and it will be a 10 months intensive evening based three times a week, and running for 10 months. So the foundations, the cornerstones of these programs are provided here with the core modules ranging from understanding the healthcare industry, different players' interaction between each other, regulatory regime, and then we have strategic management of health organizations in Asia, financial perspective and techniques, for healthcare industry in particular, and market access, health economics, leadership and entrepreneurship in health as a part of soft skill and personal development, and new health frontiers in Asia. And so, who should apply this program? 3 targets. One is high potential postgraduates in life science, general, business, or medicine and pharma. So in the second category, we are looking for young, ambitious executives working in health industry, and they'd like to boost their learning curve or accelerate the promotion ladder in the company. And also for young professionals that who are going to take new roles and responsibilities are also welcomed and be our participants. We are going to launch this by December 2014, and the program is delivered on a 3-evening session every week basis, with exception on 10 full days for the whole course, 10 months. So we make this feasible for working adults. They can come to study after work, and so the application deadline will be 2 months after we start our program, so that will be 15 October 2014, and online application format will be available in May next month. So without further ado, I'd like to present our first speaker, for the keynote speaker, Professor Gérard Pouvourville from ESSEC France, to present this topic and to tell us more about why he thinks that this topic is critical in this region and in health industry. Over to you, Gérard.
Thank you, Alan, for a very nice presentation. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Actually, I feel a bit embarrassed because I'm talking in front of a very knowledgeable audience. Also, audience, of course, from Asia-Pac, and I don't pretend that I know the region that well. So I'll be waiting for questions and comments, actually, on this particular issue. I'm also embarrassed because I was told that I should have worn a tie. I don't have a tie. So perhaps somebody can lend me one? George? No, that's fine, that's fine. I'm also embarrassed because I forgot my business card at the hotel. So I'm really not in the mood of the region, right? So, and well, nevertheless, and I'd like to talk about this issue and address a certain number of questions on coverage with evidence and performance-based risk-sharing agreements. I'll try to make it short because I like Dhinagar and George to interact with me and, of course, with the audience. As usual, professors have too many slides, so I'll cut them down. Eventually, we can come back to that. The other point I'd like to make is I'm really, I have worked on this issue on my side for the French pharma industry, but basically most of the work I've done was done with eSport Task Force, the members of whom are here, especially Lou Garrison, Adrian Towson, but also people you know from University of Washington, Sean Sullivan, John Carlson. They've written a lot, much more than I have done, and they've done a lot of empirical work on this issue. And I've borrowed a lot of the data information that they have provided, but still, I was in the task force, so I did my own job, but I'd like to acknowledge their contribution. So why are we talking about coverage with evidence and risk-sharing agreements? Basically, I think companies, either medical devices or pharma, have been facing a major change in the paradigm of access to markets in the past years. I mean, perhaps 10 years ago, 15 years ago, basically once the company had made proof through a clinical trial or whatever, that they had demonstrated the efficacy or the positive benefit risk ratio of their product, they could go to market and they could benefit from the patent protection period. And there was not so much challenge about the effectiveness of the drug once it was on the market. So basically the payer was accepting clinical evidence which was provided and didn't ask that many questions about whether or not the drug was working. This has changed considerably. Of course, this has changed for funding reasons, financial reasons, more constraints on budgets, specifically in European markets. This has also changed because there's been a growing concern not only about efficacy but also on effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And progressively, the effects of new products, whether medical devices or drugs, has been questioned beyond the initial evidence provided by companies when through registration or through through registration procedures. I think, of course, this has been aggravated in the recent years by the context of biologics. I mean, very expensive drugs coming to the market with high prices, of course, but not only the case. It's not only the case of high prices. These drugs raise some anxiety and uncertainty on the safety issues in the long term. I've heard doctors talking about biotech drugs, tinkering with the immune system, not really knowing what's going to happen in the long term with such drugs, which are in most cases systemic versus other more classic chemical drugs. So potential multiple indication and high costs, etc., etc. So definitely, yes, biologics have aggravated, I would say, the concern of payers on residual remaining uncertainties on the effectiveness and on the safety of drugs when they come to the market. Now, what type of uncertainties? I think it's interesting to focus on that, and I'm quoting Task Force here, is that, of course, the nature of uncertainty that you're going to be identifying does have an incidence on what requirements a payer may have in terms of coverage with evidence, providing evidence once the drug or the medical device is on the market. Sometimes it's uncertainty in internal validity of the clinical trials, the efficacy, the surrogate markers or endpoint, problems of small sample size, inappropriate comparatives. In this particular case, I would say that that kind of uncertainty faces payers with the impression that the clinical development of the product is not finished, that the companies have not gone far enough, and eventually they would be willing, they would be happy if companies continue their development, I mean traditional development through clinical trials and controlled trials. Uncertainty in external validity is another issue. The question is, does the drug work once it's on the market? How can we demonstrate a link from surrogate to long-term outcomes, like cholesterol level and morbid mortality? Okay, you're showing that you're controlling your glycemic levels with your new type 2 diabetes drug, but how do I know that this will eventually reduce severe cardiovascular or other events? Issues of heterogeneity of the population which is included in the trials, meaning that there may be different responses amongst patients. And that, I think, is more of a concern for medical devices, diffusion uncertainty. What's going to happen? It's not only changing appropriate populations, so what's going to happen? How are the healthcare providers going to basically appropriate this new technology? And what's going to be the learning curve? And how is it going to evolve through time? And what changes also may this induce in the organization and delivery of healthcare? So, as you may see, the uncertainties are different and require probably different solutions or different models to cope with them. Well, in general, there is a global response, which is basically companies have been required to provide more and more additional evidence once the product is launched. To inform on the uncertainties that I've been identifying. And coverage is formally or informally accepted conditionally to the provision of this evidence. So when we talk about risk sharing and coverage with evidence, I think that the right term to talk about what has been happening is coverage with evidence, which is more or less generalized. Risk sharing is only the case where eventually there might be some conditions in terms of reimbursement and pricing related to the evidence which is provided to that kind of program. So coverage with evidence is a generality. In most cases now, companies would be required to provide new evidence. The question of risk sharing is eventually when companies are faced with a formal link between the results provided through coverage with evidence and pricing or coverage. This leads to very, of course, different uncertainties, different institutional contexts, different payers, different payment schemes. So there's a wide variety of coverage with evidence agreements and eventually performance-based risk-sharing agreements. For example, in France, in many cases, post-launch studies are required to inform the reassessment of a drug or a medical device after a 5 years period. It's not systematic, but it happens when either there's a large budget impact which is expected, or there is some uncertainty on the effectiveness. Safety has always been more or less checked for, but on effectiveness. In Italy, for example, you do have payments based on ex-ante outcomes, and then there's a payback. I mean, it's if the performance targets are not met. They could also be conditional pricing agreements, or they can also be only for research access. Only for research access is basically the case when you don't trust what's in the initial clinical trials and you want to pursue, basically, the clinical development. All around the world, also. This I borrowed from a publication from John Parsons and Lou Garrison. And as you may see, their most recent publication has identified these agreements are not public in general, so these are the public ones, or the ones where you can get public information. A total of 149 performance-based schemes by country. Not coverage with evidence, but performance-based scheme by country. Here, Italy is holds the record. Italy holds the record because it has almost systematically for oncology drug, it has set in a P for P requirement. United Kingdom is second. France is over there. Is over there because we're doing a lot of CED in France, but not that much performance-based agreements. And it's also a growing trend, as you may see. It has increased quite tremendously in the past 7 or 8 years. Now, as I said, coverage with evidence covers a wide variety of arrangements. Checking for time again. Here's the professor taking over, speaking too long. This is borrowed from the E-Sport Task Force taxonomy. And what I would like to, identify here on this slide is that what we're talking about really is not cost sharing or financial arrangements such as budget capping, utilization capping, discounts or price volumes. These are, I would say, commercial or financial arrangements, not necessarily linked to producing new evidence on the effectiveness of the drug. Oh, there we go. I'd like to focus on this part of the graph, and I'd like to point out to this line here, I would say, and point out to the fact that in some case, agreements do require to provide evidence to inform decision uncertainty. Oops, okay. But this can be linked or not linked to a pre-specified agreement on the relationship between the results of the coverage with evidence and pricing or coverage, right? So sometimes, basically, the payer will say, well, do the study and sit at the table and we'll discuss. Sometimes there will be a formal link with coverage or pricing decisions. The other issue, of course, is here. It's the issue of what you're measuring. Are you measuring intermediate endpoints or clinical endpoints? By clinical endpoints, I mean hard endpoints like mortality. As you may imagine, it does make a lot of difference, specifically if clinical endpoints may be far away in time, right? In terms of what kind of study and requirements of the study you are going to be doing. So this, I think, are two important points I'd like to come back to. The other thing, which does not appear perhaps very clearly here, is that in some case, coverage with evidence will be, I would say, population-based. So companies will be asked to do some follow-up on the whole population of patients who are treated by their drug or medical device. And in some cases, and specifically when you're talking about pay for performance, you're not really asking the company to collect evidence on a population base with an epidemiological design, control, etc. Basically, you're working patient by patient, identifying whether or not the treatment works by patient. Makes a huge difference, as you may imagine, of course, in terms of data collection, in terms of accessibility, immediate accessibility to a penalty or to a reward, and also in terms of monitoring the whole set of agreement. So this notion of individual, patient-based, I would say, agreement versus population-based agreement, formalization, pre-specified formalization of a penalty or a reward related to the results of the study, and also this issue of what you're measuring, how are you measuring performance on intermediate endpoints or on hard endpoints or clinical endpoints. I think that these are some of the major characteristics of the agreements that you can observe around the world. So to make it a bit faster, I have identified 3 ideal types. Now, many people will say this is oversimplification, but nevertheless, I think it's an easy way to present what has been going on and basically to use the distinctions I've been making. First one is no cure, no pay. Basically, very simple. For example, NICE, quite an old agreement with Velcade, Johnson's drug, where basically the company and NICE have agreed upon endpoints which could be measurable to decide whether or not the treatment had failed and whether or not the treatment should be continued, and eventually what paybacks should the company do to NICE. Italy present this scheme rapidly. They do that systematically for oncology drugs. One of the issues here, when you discuss with my colleagues, we discussed this issue with my colleagues. One of the issue here, are they really risk-sharing agreements? A lot of people say no, they're price discounts, right? So we can discuss this. Actually, I think that the major advantage of such schemes is, at least, I would say, their apparent simplicity versus other schemes. I see that Annie is frowning. The second one is see and pay. I would call that, I would say, conditional coverage or pricing. What I mean by see and pay is that the company and the payer will agree on some set of collection of data on a population base to measure the actual performance of a treatment through time on indicators with the pre-specification of what the target should be to either confirm the price or confirm coverage or eventually change the price. The most famous one, and not the most successful one, is the NICE agreement with the companies who actually sold the first interferon betas and the Copaxone, glatiramer and Copaxone for multiple sclerosis. I'll come back to that. Australia has also signed an agreement on Bosentan for pulmonary arterial hypertension, basically based on the fact that the Australian sickness fund would pay for the treatment only if the company was able to demonstrate an increased performance in mortality. Not in mortality, sorry, longevity, I should say. Put the wrong way around. So this is population-based, and there's a pre-specified formal link between outcomes and pricing or coverage. And there's the French way. French way is, you guys do the study, and when it's finished, come to the table and we'll rediscuss. So no pre-specified. It may be a good solution, right? After all. Of course, it opens a lot of space for discussion, negotiation, and controversies, but this is the way we do most of our coverage with evidence, right? No cure, no pay, one example. The IFA risk-sharing procedure, basically for all oncology drugs. So what's decided is number of initial cycles for treatment, then you identify non-responders, then treatment to stop, and eventually a discount on prices paid or a reimbursement is made, a payback is made to the Italian payer. or the treatment for responders, the treatment is continued and the treatment will be covered by NHS. I think the interesting, and they've set up a very nice internet follow-up system, very effective, quite impressive. I think, of course, the benefit of such a scheme is that it's very simple in its principle. Now, does it provide new evidence on the effectiveness of the drug? Not formally, as a cohort or epidemiological study could do it, but those patients are included de facto in registries. So you can basically do ex post studies in the registries to check for the effectiveness in real life of treatment.
Have you seen from these registries change in label, by example?
No, they don't change labels. No, they basically no.
Because when you analyze, you could see,
Yeah.
you know.
Yes, there hasn't been much post hoc analysis of the registers by the Italians yet. They could do that, but not so much publications on that issue. So it does require monitoring treatment delivery, and it does require following the treatment delivery on patient-per-patient basis. Of course, there's a lot of controversy on how do you define responders and non-responders. That's part of the game, right? It's not per se a CED agreement. I've said that already. So, CNPA, multiple sclerosis agreement in the UK, perhaps some of you know it already, perhaps I'm repeating old things, but I think it has some sort of exemplarity as something that you should not renew, right? Basically, before 2002, NICE had made a recommendation not to cover interferon betas and glatiramer copaxone for multiple sclerosis, not on the basis that they were not, they had no efficacy, but on the basis that the cost per quality was too high, right? So for an economic reason, not for an effectiveness reason. And basically the agreement, and I think it's the only one that I know, is based on the fact that the companies, there was a lot of pressure from patients. They wanted to have access to the drug. So they set up the scheme, and the scheme is based on the fact that the companies had to prove that they did really meet the threshold in terms of qualities, not in terms of clinical benefits, in terms of qualities, right? So what happened is that, they set up a cohort of patients. I mean, there was centers, reference centers who were selected, who could treat those patients, and information was collected on the follow-up of patients and their status, functional status, etc., etc. And the key points here, and this is why I think probably this experience should not be repeated, is first that it took about 3 years before the inclusion period was over, right? In most cases, in most countries, 3 years after, things have changed so much and reassessment is there. I mean, the processes, decision processes have gone forward, right? Then it took another 4 years before a first interim analysis could be done, right? And at the time when the intermediary analysis was done, what happened, and I talked with George on that, what happened is that a lot of good people started saying the methodology of this is lousy. So the results are controversial, we can't use them. Methodology had been agreed upon, 7 years before. So basically, there was a group, the governance group of this study said, well, yes, the results are negative, but there is some doubt about that, and we should continue, and so we're not going to change prices. And of course, other groups said, we spent a lot of money on that, it's wasteful money. Finally, a third part of the group said, well, at least patients in England had access to treatment, so it is a benefit. So it's perhaps not considered as a failure, but I think here we're raising an issue that if you're setting up a study which may be very attractive in terms of its scientific, epidemiologic, methodological basis, and you know that epidemiologists love to have, or clinical epidemiologists love to have long follow-ups over time, very nice, everybody agrees. But when it comes to use it for a decision, it may be not a thing to do too long. Especially, and I will come back to that, especially one of the problems I've been facing on many cases is that you can agree on a methodology at the very beginning on what you're going to do, but it doesn't avoid controversies when the results are published. Never avoids that, eventually. Second, complementary information could have come from other sources in between. Other studies have been done which eventually contradict the results that you're finding. So it's very hard to hold contractual agreements when you have that kind of design. See and pay, conditional pricing in France, and I'll skip then to my conclusion because I want us to have a discussion. Conditional pricing in France. Now that's an interesting case. It's a case, the pricing committee in France has admitted that it may be that in some cases a drug or a medical device cannot demonstrate a benefit, a potential benefit, which is linked to that attribute, because clinical trials are too short or because it's too hard to measure, for example, compliance. So in this case, the pricing committee would agree to let the company do an ad hoc study to demonstrate that this attribute is there, and eventually condition the price to the fact that you demonstrate this benefit. Now, this is quite a risky agreement for a company, because basically what happens is that the initial price that they're asking for is granted, but at the end of the study, if the results are not there, the company will have to pay back the difference between what the pricing committee wanted to pay the first time and the granted price through time. So the financial risk for a company can be important. Annie loves this example because she was responsible for the study. Well, she was involved. I'll just quote this one. It was for long release form of risperidone, which was a drug which had been on the market for quite a time, and the company argued that the fact that there was a long-acting effect of the drug could lead to a lower relative risk of hospitalization, and thus that the drug deserved to get a premium price over the price of the other form. Well, the study did demonstrate that, actually, so it was actually a success. See and talk, I've talked about that. Now, the French post-launch observational studies, basically, most often they do focus on a substitution to existing treatment, off-label, eventually overuse or underuse, posology, etc. The basis of such studies is that basically there's no formal penalty or reward. Oh, there's a formal penalty. If the companies do not perform the study, they have to pay a penalty. But if they perform it, the use of these studies and the input of this information in the decision is not formalized. Okay, so I'd like to go to my sort of final conclusion. Final conclusion to give some time for the discussion. One of the issue here is I wanted to talk about are risk-sharing arrangements desirable, but George and Dhinagar will be there to answer that question from the company's perspective, and I'll be happy to discuss with them. One issue is, are risk-sharing agreements feasible? Key issues. Protocol design, of course, and choice of methodology, but a critical issue is the capacity in a given country the quality of the capacity of monitoring and data management required by, for example, population-based agreement. And this is really a critical resource, and if you don't have it, it may be difficult to proceed to that kind of study. There's an issue about the independence of monitoring, of course. That's an important issue, completeness of contract. Contracts that companies may sign with public authorities and legal value of contracts. It's difficult to have complete contracts for the reasons that I've mentioned. Basically, you provide with the information. Suppose that the information, more or less confirms your initial assumption. You cannot avoid that eventually the payer will use other sources of information to contradict your results. So it's very difficult to have a complete result because information can come from other sources and eventually challenge the information which is provided by the contract. Legal value of contract. Again, I'm talking under your basically control. In France, the government is not held by that kind of contract. They can decide that, for good reasons, force majeure, as we say, they're not held by the terms of the contract, and companies cannot do much about that. So contracts are sometimes not legal. Timing is a key issue, and I'd like to go back to what I said. Basically, the provision of data through CED has to be made alongside the timelines of decision processes. If it's not the case, if it takes too long to provide the information, then there's a problem. There's an issue also about the publicity of results. Are the results, this is public money eventually, I mean private money done for, required by public authorities, but eventually this is research which is produced as a public good. So basically for all the community, including physicians, etc., it's really interesting to possibly have access to the data, which is not always the case in the contract. Funding, I'll skip to that rapidly. The other issue, of course, is externalities. The first company which is held by that kind of contract may eventually produce information which benefits from other competitors coming behind, which will not have to do this, the issue. So as a perspective, certainly CED will continue to increase. It doesn't mean that it's going to be specifically linked to risk-sharing agreements. The issue here is, if they are, they can be either patient-based or population-based. I would say that in the second category, that can be assimilated to the extension of the clinical trial development plan. So it's more like continuing the development. This issue here is important. Are they truly CED or risk sharing or just price discount? I would argue that they are probably price discounts and not really risk sharing agreements. Population-based agreements are complex and will be probably reserved to very specific cases where companies meet specific difficulties to demonstrate outcomes in clinical trials. And of course, the issue here is, could the need for CED be minimized with better pre-registration discussions between payer, registrations, authorities, and companies? This is the bet that has been made in Europe, for example, and we will see if this will lead to other developments. Thank you very much. Sorry to have been this long.
So we have two panelists. I'd like to invite George Poole to come first. Then you have some slides you want to show us before you approach to proceed to the panel.
I mean, you can. I don't really believe I need to. I can sit up here.
Okay, let's go. Yes. So now this is the session that I think Gérard posed several questions on the key issues and some challenges that that companies are facing. So George and Dhinagar, can you provide some perspective from companies about this risk-sharing agreement?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about this from a pharma and medical device industry perspective. I think the first comment I would like to make is the question is whether risk-sharing agreements should they be an exception or should they be a rule? So I think that's kind of a very critical question. The perspective I have personally is that it has to be an exception. It has to be an exception where the payer or the manufacturer cannot guarantee access otherwise. Yeah, so it has to be an exception. I mean, a lot of people would think, okay, so if we have poor evidence when you come to the market with a product, can you use risk sharing as a way to get it? The answer is no. It's not a substitute. It is perhaps going to be complementing in exceptional circumstances. And those exceptional circumstances could vary. I think that's a very important consideration to have. What is the market that you're operating in? What is the underlying barrier? What is the underlying barrier to access? Is it a price when it's going to be a very simple agreement? Or is it going to be something more complex with respect to uncertainty when it comes to the volume, the number of patients, for example, or uncertainty in terms of the data. So I think the second point I would make is that you need to really understand what is the barrier to access that such an agreement is going to address. And obviously that would define what type of agreement, whether it's a simple agreement or it's a more complex agreement. The third point I would like to make is I think kind of these agreements originated, by people being very creative. And I think the environment is changing to be becoming more creative because of a number of drivers. I think the first one is there is expectation from payers in general saying, I don't want to pay for a drug, I would rather pay for outcomes. And I think this change is happening a lot in countries like US and Europe and eventually here in Asia as well. Payers are saying, okay, so I don't want to pay for a physician just to see a patient. I want to pay for something that I would get as an outcome. So the outcome or the quest for outcome from a payer standpoint is a very important driver, and it is increasing. The second one is, I think, manufacturers want to optimize the time to the market. So you want to come to the market very soon. And sometimes that means limited data, especially when it comes to long-term outcomes. There is an example, I have a slide, but I'll kind of explain the example. The example is a BMS example in Australia. Anyone from BMS here? No? Okay. So it's a drug called Envisage, which is for treatment of melanoma, so skin cancer. And this drug had very good clinical trial data, looking at survival for 5 years. But melanoma patients, because it's just a skin cancer, they could survive for a very long time. So the hypothesis was this drug is a very much of a breakthrough drug which would reduce the mortality, and they had data for up to 4 years. But then what happens after 5 years? Do these patients continue to survive? And you couldn't possibly expect a manufacturer to actually wait for all the patients to die and have this evidence before they come to the market. So the Australian government said, okay, look, we don't know what is the outcome beyond 5 years. Let's look at how we address this gap. Eventually, what they did is a coverage with evidence development, where the manufacturer said, okay, so we'll collect this data over a long period of time, and if the mortality stacks up to our claims, then we're fine. If the mortality is worse for our drug than what we think it is, then we would pay that difference back to you at the end of 5 years. So that's kind of the agreement. So I think the second point I wanted to make is I think the payers are the manufacturers are increasingly finding ways to optimize the time to the market, and they're probably not going to be 100% of the time meeting the expectations of the payers when it comes to the data. The third driver is also, compared to how we were 10 years ago, I think the data infrastructure is much better. I think kind of people are tracking data, big data, and availability of data has become much easier. So I think these three drivers, the quest for real outcomes from a payer standpoint, time to market considerations from a manufacturer standpoint, and data availability. I think these three drivers point to one direction, which is it's going to be used more and more in the future. I think that's kind of the second perspective I want to share. The third one is just, I think, implementation. I think the key is, once you define what your option space is, if you're a manufacturer, the key is implementation. How do you make it work? I think it's kind of very significant thought needs to go into how you define the data collection, how do you want to tie the data collection to the payment, which is the important, and also services. Some of you might come from medical devices, and the question is, the outcomes depend not only on the drug or the device, but what happens? Do patients actually take the drug? So another example is kind of a US-based example where Merck actually did an agreement with Cigna, which is a kind of a big healthcare plan in the US. And they said, look, we want to make sure that the patients who are having diabetes not only are kind of prescribed the drug, but also they take the drug. So actually they invested in the program to make sure that the outcomes are generated. So I think about service as well and what goes with it. And it's not just an agreement, but the whole package of how you collect the data, how you tie the payment, how you think about guaranteeing outcomes using potentially services as an additional value of the service. So I'll stop there because I'll need some questions. So George.
What they said. I'm coming at this from a completely device lens and a much more commercial side. When you looked at his slide and you saw the left-hand side, the reality of this is we like to call them risk sharing. What's at risk? Payers don't want to pay more. I don't want to make less. That's the bottom line. Call it what you want. So somehow we're trying to fight over the pie. And when you start to move into fancy words like risk, I'm risking margin. They're risking not being able to cover a population. Then we talk about speed to market. I don't know a device that actually comes to market with any long-term data. Remember, for me to be approved CE mark or FDA, I need safety and efficacy. Candidly, my data has to say I don't kill anybody. So it's completely different from that of a pharmaceutical side. The features and iterations of a device is not as well protected under IP. Meaning, by the time that I get it out in a prototype, 5 other people have it in unregulated markets. May have the same efficacy. I don't know, I can't follow through. I've got different anatomical constraints. I need to get it out there fast, and by the time I can have any true long-term data to leverage a true risk agreement against, to bet on the outcomes long-term, I'm on my 5th generation. It's done. So when you look at these, I really do try to say it is a commercial venture. And we're trying to do the best social good, being able to finance the continuation of innovation, at the same time doing it at an ability to have a population afford it. My pricing at Medtronic, and again, the discussion for me today is, the risk is Medtronic let me out to talk. Because that is really, honestly, our issue. How much margin is enough? Where do the margins work? We don't make as much as the payers think. We make more than we'll ever tell the payers. So the risk is actually being honest. And that's really where I sort of beat this around to say the risk is taking the chance to find out what's fair. And that takes a level of transparency on the total system. What does it cost you to manage the life cycle of the patient? Where can I actually impart change? Create value in that system. What do I have to offer? What's that cost me? What's your fair share? What's my fair share? Let's move on. That's really the only way it's going to work. So I don't mean to change the title because I think we all do think of it as risk sharing. Medtronic is a device company. We're the largest pure play device company in the world. We are just moving into solutions and services because we frankly realize transactional device exchange is short for this world. It would take 5 other companies to match what our portfolio does. At the same time, as you move to services and solutions, it has to be about value. Not only the value we're providing in the system, I need everybody to be very clear. I am extracting value from the system. I am a for-profit organization, publicly traded, and have shareholder returns that I'm accountable for. In saying such, that's not saying that I can't do what my mission states. Alleviate pain, restore health, extend life. That's very important. So I think part of the risk in how we do this and speed to the market, I'm never going to have long-term data. I'm going to hide behind safety and efficacy, so I can't barter against it. I don't have a cure. I'm further down the treatment algorithm as a device company. Meaning, the number of examples I can give you of the acquisitions that we've overpaid for because a pharmaceutical company tried to outbid me to make sure it never got off a shelf. There's truth to that. There is a huge industry side of this, and it becomes more the economics of healthcare and what are we willing to risk within the transparency that's going to unlock the potential for all of us to help each other. So we do have several examples at Medtronic where we've come outside of the box a little bit on these, And they're different for us as a company, but again, they're completely commercial transactions. Public-private partnerships, where we start to go into countries and finance cath labs. And we'll put $25 million into a country. We'll finance all their cath labs in exchange for them to put those funds towards the devices that'll help people, whether they be coronary stents, whether they be pacemakers, whether they be angioplasties. Without doing this, again, we run into the same constraints of the governments who are going to say, you cost too much. We now pay this much. Okay? So now we find ourselves in universal healthcare markets. You have Japan. Japan, 120 million population, 259,000 PCIs, coronary stents. Indonesia, 240 million people, 11,000. 11,000. As a device manufacturer, I'm willing to be transparent and take risk because I can guarantee you 99.9% of the population who needs my devices doesn't get them. I got plenty of room to go, right? I'm fine. So in that, you look at Indonesia for an example and you say, how can Indonesia now say I'm going to pay $700 for a stent? I don't want to play there. Thanks. So now you have some of the most respected companies in the world who don't have a product portfolio, who aren't willing to risk their margins, who just saw the long-term prospects of a market with none of the population, as you suggested, to barter against, telling me, nah, non-starter. I either need to buy a company, invest in another technology, get local, because, again, I'm Medtronic, I'm global by accident. Right? That's not a derogatory statement. We're learning to be global, but we are a Midwestern U.S. company. Right? This is hard. We are trying to figure out why Western medicine doesn't apply all the time over here, and we apply the same practices, and we expect different results. No. Yeah. So, again, I'm trying to be candid to incite or provoke thought, because I have way more questions than I have answers. I have strong opinions. I've went into just about every government. I could call most of the ministers within our area. And even when you say, I want to do a risk-sharing agreement, they say, all right, what are you going to give me? Well, what are you going to give me? I don't know. What do you want? I want 50% of your treatable population. Okay, I'll give it to you. All right, great. What's my price? For that, I will give you a price of this. Right? So we're done, right? Well, no, you got to convince the doctors to do it. Huh? So then you have a clinical firewall, right, where the doctors are sitting there saying, well, I didn't sign up to your agreement. You have no ability. I'm a doctor. Don't tell me how to practice medicine. You're a payer. Yeah. So the breadth of this topic is fun, and there's so many different tentacles by which you can go off of. Where we've found as a device manufacturer is, invest in me, I'll invest in you. And is it a lowering of cost, as you said? Is it a guise? Yes. I'm willing to leverage my margin to help create greater access to enable you to treat more patients, which has led to certain things such as telemedicine. In the US, for example, we just purchased a company called CardioCount. In the US, their system being outbased, especially around heart failure, the amount that a hospital has to pay for readmission, rehospitalization, is huge. If we can telemetrically monitor these patients, catch episodes before they happen, stop them from going into the ER, congesting the system, lowering efficiency, the hospital won't be penalized. In exchange for the savings and penalties that you have each year for signing up for CardioCount, we will take some of those proceeds. That's one example. Longevity of payment. We've gone into patient financing, affordability being a barrier. I'm a fairly cash-rich company, fortunately. Why do I need money up front for a patient to benefit from my products? Why might they have to get a substandard product? I can wait. We've started in the Philippines recently, as one of the slides will show, where any patient making $5 a day and meets our EMI, go ahead and pay me. Pay me what you can. I'll figure it out. And the payback rates and the EMI type psychometric testing on 5 questions, there's like a 0.3% non-payback rate. So when you're going around emerging geographies and you have countries trying to develop, yet their populations are saving every penny they have to avoid catastrophic illness, you will never create domestic consumption. Without that, you will not emerge, you will not attract foreign investment, you will not put money into schools, you will not put money into infrastructure. So I think risk sharing, I'm all for it. Price lowering, I call it that too, all right? Because I'm going to get my fair share, but it's going to take a level of transparency that a lot of us aren't willing to go down that road. And if I went to a payer and I said, for example, if I went to you as a payer and I said, I would like all of your covered lives, what's your first response?
What am I getting?
I've got a lot of competitors. Whatever I give them, they'll be there tomorrow and give them something less.
Right.
All right, put your track shoes on, race to the bottom. Who's going to win? Then we really can't continue to innovate and help as many patients and grow their missions. So, trying to inject some humor, but also trying to say that as we're learning this, I think it's going to be changing the game. And the way we're doing it now, if the way we're changing to is risk sharing, I'm all for it. Let's take the risk. My risk profile is fairly high. But I think it's really more about changing the game on how we interact, what the truth around it is, who really wants what. Can we validate long-term outcomes? I can't. I need to have you accept some of the risk so that I can quantify the metrics, keep track of some of the long-term outcomes, and as we go through time, I can show total net savings. And from a device manufacturer, my priority is one, shareholder value. I have to do it at a fair profit. I think where we get stuck is, who determines what a fair profit is, and who's going to disclose it? That's really how I feel.
Thank you. I think we need to take questions from the room.
Well, I think we
comments.
I think every time we have Georgia, it's always very provocative about the question that the topic, the risk shared by who, what kind of risk we are talking about. Is risk transfer or just a risk agreement? Before we open to the question Q&A to the floor, I'd like Gérard, you'd like to give you some comments or rebuttals?
No, I think I fully follow what Dhinagar said. I'm on the point that I think these kind of agreements should be very specific and rare, and specifically, yes, focused on some situations, not only for prices but also for the scarcity of evidence, where for good reasons there is scarce evidence, and you do need to continue development before you accept to definitely offer access, wide access to the market. I also follow you, medical devices. I mean, you're basically, one point I made is that a lot of those coverage with evidence probably are too ambitious in terms of what kind of targets you're going to meet, and payers do agree that they want to have. It's not necessarily easy. Perhaps a lot of people will say it's not good evidence, but they need to have simple outcomes indicators, intermediate endpoints, surrogate endpoints that they can check easily, just because they want to keep the process of coverage with evidence in a timely fashion, that they can make their decisions about it. And I guess medical devices is a good example when this may happen. It doesn't mean that it's easy to do for medical devices, but I think the last point I would like to make is that sometimes I guess that companies are proposing risk-sharing agreements, either because they think that, as Dhinagar said, they have good evidence but not sufficient, and they know they want to go fast to the market, they know that their evidence is not enough, but sometimes also because their pricing strategy is not good. And that it's not a good solution. I mean, I know some companies who go to the payer and say, what about a risk-sharing agreement? I'll give it out free for the first 20 patients, and then after you're going to pay me back whatsoever. When I have that kind of agreement coming from a company, I say to myself, these guys are not confident either in their drug or in their prices. So Okay, so it might be a very bad excuse for some companies to propose risk-sharing agreements. And payers, companies should think that, and sometimes, companies come in with very sophisticated, aggressive pricing whatsoever. I don't think payers are really interested. I think payers are interested in simple situations like the ones you're describing, and eventually, yes, providing with information in the long term on the effectiveness of the drug. So, yes, you have to identify what the good situations, what the specific situations are where you can do that. And what may happen though in the future is that, yes, payers may be willing to ask more and more for cure pay or agreements, but I think they will do that basically for one reason, is that they have to face affordability of the treatments that they're putting on the market. So they want patients to have access to the drug or to the product, to the medical device, but they cannot afford to pay for too much failure. So I guess that in the present situation, and because of a certain number of products being very expensive on a small number of patients, companies can expect that there's going to be more and more P4P, pay for outcomes. But it's going to come from the payer side, not from the company side. So that's my sort of general comment.
Now we take questions from the floor. Since we are the audience are coming from different sectors, non-profits and private sectors, freelance consultants and public sectors. So if you have questions, raise your hand. Please identify yourself and the organization you are working for. We have questions on the floor? Yes, Shriti.
Hi, I'm Shruti. I'm an MBA student from India, and I'm a public health consultant. I have a public health background before that. So, just one question each, both of you. I think for Dhinagar, the question is, you spoke about how you feel that the risk-sharing agreement space is only going to grow, and you feel optimistic about this mechanism being useful to bring in innovative technologies to market. Most of the literature, actually, a lot of the literature in the past has pointed to the fact that just the cost of administrating these schemes is too high, and it kind of makes this whole arrangement not really sustainable, or there's a big question mark, kind of is this sustainable? So I just wanted to understand if you can share any of your experience on, what do you think about, like you also spoke about entering services and really checking for compliance. So I think there are examples, I think in Germany and Australia, where the companies have tried, like to also follow up on compliance to make sure that they prove that this can work. So I just want to understand your thoughts on that. And I think my question, was, it's good. I think we also spoke just before the session. So it's good to have some counter arguments on risk-sharing agreements. So I wanted to understand, I think from you, you seem to say that risk-sharing agreements, especially in emerging markets, still may not be viable right now because the people may not have ability to pay. So what do you think is the way forward? Do you think you want to actually directly work with patients, consumers, to look at innovative financing? Is that the way forward here in this region?
I think I would go somewhat anecdotally on this to say, you might not be there now, but from a company perspective, it's more about disease management. How do you manage the entire disease state? And can any one company do that? Because then I could get into what I would consider a risk-sharing agreement with you. Meaning, how much does the government spend on diabetes a year? What is the current cost? What's the incidence? What's the prevalence? Can I manage all aspects of that? From a company, if you spend $1 billion a year on it, give me $1 billion. Treat everybody. Now, I will not pay for your inefficiency, you will not pay for my inefficiency. Because over time, I think that's really where the crux of it is. There's so much inefficiency in the system. Patients don't get through, it costs more. So in a true risk-sharing agreement for me, it really is more about disease management as opposed to as opposed to treating. Right? Arrhythmia, I can sell a pacemaker, I can transact. All right? Angina, I can put a stent in, I can do that. Right? What do I have to do with the patient afterwards? Because I'm not really sharing the risk of everything afterwards. All right? Follow-up care, bad outcomes, comorbidities. Right? That's not sharing. I got mine, I'm out. Right? So until one company can harness everything around the disease state and be a partner with an institution or a government to say, I offer these things. Right? And that's why the services approach is so important, because no one company can do it. I need partners. I can't just sit here and say I'm not willing to fix the problem. I'm going to compete with the St. Jude's, the Abbotts, the J&J's of the world. We all lose. Right? They have certain competencies that I don't have that are going to fit into this disease algorithm. Right? There's probably enough for all of us with good social benefit. But once you have a holistic approach to be able to meet all the needs of that disease state, then you can go in and say, I would like to manage this for you. All right? If you can treat more patients, I'll need to be more efficient. Right? If you can't treat as many patients, that's good. We're doing something on the awareness side. But each year you have a follow-up to that. But from a government perspective, you start to look at it from the disease. I chose diabetes. It could be cardiovascular care. What can you do for me for heart failure? These patients cost a lot. All right? Where are the different avenues of heart failure, from synchronization to left main to branch to the entire medical side of things? And you can see from a device side, I probably can't do that without a pharmaceutical side. So I'm going a long way to go and say that I'm still in a position to only transact. Right? And until that scale of being able to manage an entire disease is there, I'm probably not sharing in the full risk that the other party I'm trying to believe is, getting a deal, is going to be accepting of. Right? So that's where I sort of come back to, is it really risk sharing? It's not. So much can happen afterwards. 10 days in the ICU. You think they care about a stent cost after that? Nope. Right? But I didn't share in that risk. So we have to own more in that continuum of care, other than just the device, to be truly valued as someone sharing in risk. And that's a company limitation for me personally, for us.
Yeah, I think I think what George said makes a lot of sense as another reason why I think risk sharing is going to kind of increase, but in a different format. I think what you see in the literature is the examples like what was shown for the UK, for example, the multiple sclerosis, where it became so big and so complex that it couldn't, with hindsight, one could say now it's probably not going to work. But I think the agreements that we're talking about is kind of more outcomes-based payment, not transactional payments, but more outcomes-based payment, but with a very simple way to measure that outcome. I think we're talking about very simple things like, okay, does the patient die or not? Yeah. Does the patient have a HbA1c reduction of 0.5 or not? That's kind of pretty much it. Really simple, straightforward outcomes that are measured every day as part of care. Not complicated quality measures, which kind of take a lot of time, effort, and things to do, but very simple measures. So I think it's going to evolve in a different format, but I think the incentives are, from what the companies are thinking, the manufacturers are thinking, in terms of going away from selling drugs or devices into more disease management and therefore outcomes, and the payers' expectations and the availability of data all point to the risk sharing or outcomes-based payment schemes becoming more important, albeit in a very simplified format.
I think both of you have made a very important point here, is that when you're looking at coverage with evidence and you're launching or you're starting a post-launch study, eventually while you're trying to control it as best as you can, there is an issue here that the difference between experimental efficacy in the clinical trial and effectiveness in real life is both attributable probably to the drug, but it's also attributable to the system and the organization of healthcare, as you mentioned. And that's an issue here, which is quite important. How do you disentangle both effects, right? Very difficult, actually. Even if you have very good control post-launch study, it's quite difficult. Specifically, as you mentioned, the efficacy and the effectiveness of the drug is also related to both patients' behavior and prescribers' behavior. And of course, this is especially important in the medical device where the prescriber, not the prescriber, is the user also, and does make a difference here. So I think it's here. You have to keep it simple if you can, as Dhinagar said. It doesn't stop. What I'm saying here is that it shouldn't stop both companies and governments to invest in long-term clinical epidemiological study. If you don't do that, of course, a lot of good information comes from meta-analysis of studies which have been done for 5, 6, 7 years, which allow to reassess effectiveness of treatment. So I'm not saying that this kind of investment in observing in a controlled fashion how things have evolved now, how drugs effectively work, is of course indispensable. I'm not sure it should be part of some sort of agreement between companies over the price or access to a given product. I think these should be two separate things.
Your second question has not been answered, right? So you satisfied the answer is okay. And
So it's an outcomes-based question-answer session.
You're terrible, Professor. And ESSEC. I have a question to George Poole, because you've mentioned that alternative to those sophisticated risk-sharing agreements, which are not so much risk, on your opinion, you think that creating additional value is around services. And you can assume that by developing, for instance, telesurveillance with an implantable defibrillator, you can make a deal with the payer that you will reduce the number of emergency visits or whatever. But this works in the first step for a few years. But once you have disseminated the practice all over, you have to change the business model, because you are not anymore generating savings versus usual treatment, because you become the usual treatment. So my question is, how do you envisage to change the business model in the long term, and the relationship you might have with payers if you really enlarge your scope of business around services?
When I talk about services, I think the next wave of services is moving in Europe. You'll see, or the US is towards efficiency, right? And it's going to be on the hospital side. So maybe they're consulting services, maybe they're Lean Sigma opportunities. Meaning, if we can help you increase your efficiency to see more patients at the same cost, that game's only going to hold us on for so long too. At some point in time, I'm going to have to use iChat and have one physician hooked up to an OR bed looking down for help. I mean, when you look at the amount of money that we have in a distribution footprint, right, that costs money. I'm going to have to become more efficient too. And that is probably what we fight the most, right? But that will end up being our drop in prices. So services, efficiency, we'll move to the emerging side, we'll help build capacity through training and education. Right? As that capacity comes up, we'll slowly but surely have to look internally at our own inefficiencies, which I think is beyond us, I mean, at this point.
But it means you have to share the pie with all the stakeholders, and
Yes.
it's a different distribution of the shares of the pie.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing as we move to R&D outside of Minnesota. Yeah. That's going to be a big thing. We've got, all of our data is on Western. Every data set that's used for any regulatory body is on Western. You have different anatomical, etiological, in India, in China, when you look at the disease state progression, how much greater it is, how much earlier it is, We haven't even started to do true robust clinical trials over here. We just multiply incidence times prevalence. We apply it to large Western people that gene missed me, but we really don't know. And there's going to be differences in what our therapies are tomorrow than there are today. Right? I think there's going to be differences in telemedicine. Right? We will never be able to continue to support and service a 14,000 island archipelago like Indonesia. Right? But our pacemakers now can talk to one doctor with a smartphone held to the device. That's efficiency. Right? Which in return, now I don't have to hire 30,000 reps at massive amounts of cost. I'm going to have to share those savings. Yeah. But I think to your point, and I wanted to talk about yours, with reimbursement. We talked about the manufacturers having no clear science behind their pricing, which would be the tip of the iceberg on the reimbursement regulatory agencies on how they base their reimbursement. Why is it reimbursed that way? How much do you want? 20,000. We'll give you 15. Reimbursed. So, I mean, bad information in, bad information out. And that's where the transparency gap of that is really what's setting it up. The system must be flawed because it's all about who gets what. Right? We don't have, we come up with long-term savings. How much will I save the system over time if I can cure X amount of diabetes, or what will my pump do? The reimbursement was already set before I even started the study. Right? And then it's race to the bottom. So, and I don't know how long the data sets, or how large the cohort would have to be able to say, until we prove its true economic value, we will not set a reimbursement level. Right? So our pricing being an art, what can I get away with? Going to a regulatory body and trying to have good data so that they give me an around about that number. Right? And then the game begins. Did I get anywhere close to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any residents from Poole as well? And you have a question?
So in George, Poole, you mentioned very briefly that although risk sharing is a very good, seems to be a good solution to access to market, but it doesn't mean actually that the patient is going to get that drug because the prescriber was not part of this agreement and may think differently. So I'm curious to know if there is any example that actually it was a barrier to access to market.
If I understand the question correctly, you're saying there is a system in place where there's adequate reimbursement and physicians are choosing not to use the therapy or the drug?
What I'm saying is that in the risk sharing, it's an agreement between the government and the manufacturer. But there are other stakeholders actually who are in play before actually the patient gets access to the drug.
The barriers.
Do you see any example where these other stakeholders who were not involved in the discussion actually were barriers?
I'll answer it one way from a device side, then I'll ask one of you gentlemen to talk about it from the drug, because the challenge that I have is multiple competitors. Why do I not want to go to the payer? All I'm going to do is create the market for my competitors. I'm big. I'll just go out and try and sell against them. But if I go first, if I use all of my resources to create this system, they now benefit. I can't do that, right? So the example in your system is one of the reasons why I won't go. The payer won't guarantee me the volume I want. Candidly, probably because it would be wrong. I can't differentiate my product that far away from another drug-eluting stent or another pacemaker. So they will say, all right, thank you, Medtronic, for the deal. By the way, any other company with similar products offering the same price, you're part of us, and now I've created a formulary. We don't want formularies in devices. We work too hard to have differentiation. Right? That's why I would say this is a great question for the drug side, which I do think can happen.
Well, I don't have specific examples of this being related to risk sharing, but examples of where potentially technologies may be covered, but the full benefit of the technology does not go to all patients. It happens because all stakeholders have not been involved, or because some stakeholders have captured most of the rent of the innovation, specifically healthcare professionals and providers. That happens quite often. An innovation, for example, will not yield its full potential in terms of productivity gains just because a certain category of healthcare professionals just capture the rent. That happens often, and it happens in medical devices. It happens in imagery. That happens often. In the drug area, I don't know. I don't have any example. The issue here, specifically in medical devices and around procedures, is that the medical corporation, the medical specialists are competing with each other and are competing each against the others. And when an innovation comes, it's a competitive advantage for them. If they can capture most of that competitive advantage, it's good for them, but then you create a monopoly, meaning that not everybody has access to the technology. So sometimes professionals may be your worst enemies, right, George?
Very much.
Yeah, I have very little to add. I think, to your question, if there are barriers that are externalities and you cannot act upon them, you're probably not into an agreement in the first place, because there's, it's beyond the scope of what you can achieve, because there's drug and maybe there is another barrier. Which one is going to work, which one is not? If you don't have any control over it, you're probably not going to enter into an agreement. If you can have some control over it, which is Babbitt's example, what he would do is to make sure that that barrier is overcome, which by, in the example that I mentioned, which is done by a lot of manufacturers on drugs and maybe some devices as well, is to kind of say, look, we'll take care of not the drug or the device part, but the whole disease management algorithm, including reminders to the patients to take, make sure they take the drugs, or to make sure that if there is a cardiac defibrillator that detects an arrhythmia, the patient make sure that the patient comes back to the hospital. So if there is something that they can offer which addresses that barrier, it makes sense. Otherwise, it doesn't. Does that answer your question, Bobby? Please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Boya from Immunology Program in US. I would like to ask you, so all the examples that you gave us now about risk sharing referred to Europe, North America and Australia, and if you could give us some examples how it happens in Singapore. And I would be curious especially about introduction of new biologics in Singapore, because majority of people here would have that MediSave that is part of your taxpayers' money, but that is definitely not sufficient to afford the biologics, especially if they're used in a context of chronic diseases. On the other side, you may have the private insurance, but then they always have these disclaimers. They don't cover new protocols that are not standardized in Singapore, etc. So how then you break that vicious cycle? And in Singapore, for example, if you want to introduce a new product, and how that risk sharing works here.
Well, I can take a stab at this. I think risk sharing works if there is someone to share the risk with, right? I mean, here, if there is, most of the examples we're talking about is where there is a payer, and the payer covers or pays on behalf of the patients, whereas in Singapore, it's the patient who pays out of their own pocket or from their own MediSave account, and therefore the real payer here is the patient himself. So the question probably doesn't become, is there any value in doing risk sharing? Because the patients are probably not going to say, hey, does your device work? What if it doesn't work? They're more concerned about, can I afford this, and how do I pay for this? So I think it's probably not going to be risk sharing that is most applicable in the majority of these self-pay markets, but it's more around how do we think about alternative payment mechanisms and alternative risk pooling mechanisms which address the affordability gap. So I'll let the others comment on that.
I agree 100% with the patient paying. I would also take Singapore and break it down from a device side into public and private markets. You've got a private market that's cost plus. They don't care what I charge. I charge 10 to 55 to 60% of the patients who come from Indonesia who are built very, very affluent. They just cost plus. They have no cost containment mechanism. As the IHHs of the world and as the SILOMs and as the Ramses continue their IPOs, their shareholders are going to want that to happen. Right? But the hospitals on the private side are so lucrative, and these are just real estate. That's all they are. They rent space. They're brick and mortar, and I don't mean that's the business model, right? However, I'm not being pressured to share risk because they don't have a cost containment model at this point in time because of where they are. Now, as you're seeing universal health care pop up in Indonesia, as you're seeing the SILOMs try to invest in the Metro Pacifics and Philippines moving towards that, then it's going to be somewhat of an issue in a population of 5 million. You still have high credibility in Singapore. That's not going to change for a while. You still have a level of capacity. You got 28 cardiac surgeons in Indonesia, right? That's ridiculous, right, for 240 million people. So the need's there to cover that. But to his point, this market is separated from a device side very clearly on public and private. And the private being cost plus, there's no need for it. The public side, I think there is opportunity, as you said, but it's not as strenuous because you're seeing more of these public physicians moving away from benefit of health and helping patients to what we would call a low volume, high margin game. Meaning, why do I want to stay in a public hospital at 10 times and see 100 patients when I can see 3 over at Mount E and make 3 times as much? High margin, low volume. So the system's weeding itself out in different directions. I mean, that's as honest as answers I can give too.
Well, just as a compliment, I don't know enough of the Singapore situation, but the only solution here, if you want to guarantee access to expensive new treatments for not only oncology drugs, but also for drugs for autoimmune diseases here, is that it really becomes a public concern in terms of the burden of the disease for the population with high impact, for example, I guess here on productivity, for example, could be one of the issues. Loss of capacity and productive capacity. Then, in this particular case, you do not necessarily need risk sharing. I mean, then you would go to the manufacturer and say, "Hey, I have 250,000 patients to treat. What price are you going to make for me for this particular product?" So it's just price bargaining around a market that you're offering. You probably don't need risk sharing. Or you may need risk sharing if you have some uncertainty about the efficacy of the drug, but that would be for the latest biologics perhaps, but for globally for the population, if you want to offer, the basic basket of innovative drugs, which we know that work in cancer today, you don't need risk sharing. But it needs some public policy to decide that cancer is important for the population. It could be humanistic or it could be utilitarian. In terms of utilitarian, is that cancer keeps too many people out of work, for example, and that would be a justification. And then it would just be group purchasing, I'm saying.
Do you have anyone from public sectors who can pose a question to our panelists?
a provocative question, but I don't belong to the company which might be anymore, which might be implied. I'm self-consultant. I used to work for Novartis. Would like to know from Gérard and Annie what they think about the case of Avastin versus Lucentis. And it's been on the first page of the French newspaper for the past weeks. So from I think it's a good case study, and
Just explain that issue.
The case is that Lucentis and Avastin are two very close molecules in terms of their structure. They're not exactly the same though, right? You would agree that, but Avastin basically is used for cancer therapy, where Lucentis has been developed for specific application in ophthalmology, treating macular degenerescence. And Lucentis was sold at a much higher price than Avastin in this indication. But this came through an agreement between Roche and Novartis that they wouldn't compete on both fields, roughly. So it was a very clever agreement, right? So Roche was more or less committed that they would not come into the ophthalmology field, and Novartis could then exploit the molecule in the ophthalmology field. Now, of course, payers in France, just payers, I don't know, perhaps in other countries too. At the very beginning, so Avastin doesn't have the indication, registered indication for ophthalmology.
That's my point.
Doesn't have it because Roche didn't want to invest any sort of clinical trials to get the indication. But when Lucentis was not developed, actually some ophthalmologists used Avastin off-label to treat the patients. And at one time, Lucentis was, of course, reimbursed and covered. So parliamentaries in France, parliament people said, what's going on, right? We're paying a drug 20 times what we should pay just because Roche doesn't want to develop in ophthalmology. So we propose that we allow Avastin to be used for ophthalmology too. Actually, it's not yet done, but it's going to happen probably someday. So I'm not sure what. So it's not risk sharing here; it's profit sharing and market sharing, right? I mean, it's typically.
I think
it's not risk sharing at all. It's
no.
collusion, very clever collusion, basically.
The drug has been developed
In ophthalmology specifically.
in ophthalmology. The governments, be it in Italy or in France, have given a price.
Sure.
Knowing, or the government or the reimbursement agency has given a price.
Yeah.
Knowing that Avastin was there. So.
Yeah, but the Avastin didn't have the indication.
Yeah.
You cannot reimburse a drug that doesn't have the registered indication, so they were stuck, right? But now the French government is trying to overrule that.
Sorry?
The French government is trying to overrule the absence of registration for Avastin. They've funded clinical trials to show that there was equivalent efficacy, and on the basis of those trials, they will grant a temporary authorization of registration for the French nation, I mean for the French territory, and so that the treatment prices, of course, going to go down. But yes, they've granted a price, but they could. What else could they do? Avastin didn't have an indication.
Well, what they can do is to ask.
Could have they done?
What they have done, and but it's confidential, is definitely Lucentis, which is really at stake, probably has a large payback in France. So, but this is confidential, and the issue in this situation, it's not risk sharing. It's just if you go beyond a certain amount of turnover, then you have to make a payback. The problem is the confidentiality of this type of agreement, and you have the same type in the UK, by the way. Most of the patient access schemes are now essentially based on confidential discounts. So in the UK, you go through a very sophisticated process, assessing the cost of quality, blah, 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 and then you finalize it with a negotiation, with a price discount that nobody knows except the final payers. So the same story, probably, I would assume is in place for the centers. And I think it's a very nasty debate in France because of a specific example, you might think, it's really
Everybody
extreme
does the same thing.
and
Yeah.
very, very okay. But you don't change regulation which are meant to assess the safety of drugs through labeling because of one case which is excessive, and you don't change the law only for one case. You find other way to. I think it's a very nasty utilization of the power of the parliament and the government. And the point is that there is so much tense on this subject between the members of parliament who do not understand anything about what's really granting a marketing authorization and granting a price, the media and blah blah blah. So it's a very nasty situation. So we should not focus on it too much, and the French government should be wiser in its approach, and the parliament in my sense. But that's not a risk sharing.
Not at all.
Just want to add one thing Eric Van Appen said of Novartis Asia, just that there's no agreement between Novartis and Roche. I think
Here comes the
it's
disclaimer.
something I want to make things clear of political perception, but of course, the case is pending, but there's certainly no.
Never call that agreement, but it's
No.
it's an implicit collusion that they're not developing. Roche is not developing enough ophthalmology, right? Sure.
I think the cost of development is substantial.
So this is somewhat of my question for the group. At what point in time does public or societal benefit trump IP? That's what keeps us up at night, right? How can we, a company with a mission all about the patient, not be portrayed as the profit-mongering organization to a country who can easily reverse engineer anything I have at sizably lower rates? I mean, you look at a place like Singapore and you look at some of the drugs where you've seen it, where you've gone into the Philippines, you've seen where in India, where some of the big ones have actually purchased, that didn't work out, right? We'll purchase Indian drug pharmaceutical manufacturers, that's how we'll do it. Well, that's not going to work, right? And now you really don't have a leg to stand on. There's IP protection. I agree with you, pay a lot of money to develop these things, only for them to be copied overnight.
Yeah.
Yet my leverage is I want to get my cost of investments back at the expense of what? People's lives. I mean, this is not again, I think I would ask for a show of hands. If you were running a country, how would you react? Would you copy intellectual property, for the benefit of the good? Raise your hand if it's yes. Completely ignore intellectual property for the benefit of the good,
Yes.
the population, right? This is a democratic society too, so you're up for election. Votes count. Show of hands, obviously, for those who wouldn't, who will not encroach upon intellectual property no matter what, the public benefit. Go ahead, raise your hands. Everybody who just wants the drug or the device and doesn't care how you get it, raise your hands. See where I'm going with this?
Why didn't you raise your hand, actually?
I know where you stand, right?
Is it a conflict of interest?
We're actually,
I was
overpaid
watching.
to say that.
I was watching, right?
I personally hold up my hands for the public interest. That's just how I've always been. I work for Medtronic. They don't like it that I say that. But I also know all of our companies have shelves full of outdated technology, that IP and patents have gone past, that we could incubate in a lot of these emerging markets, give them a foothold, gain royalties on stuff that's sitting there that we're not going to get anyway, and see if they're maybe more applicable to areas we just don't know enough about. So, I mean, I put it out there because I've always been interested in that. What did you do? I would choose the alternative. And you see places like Philippines with United. I mean, big companies come in, Pfizer, Merck, and GSK, next thing you know, and we're not, from where we stand, we're not going to win lawsuits in these countries. They are going to favor the local company. That's it. Which I think maybe that's why we have some of the costs that we do in the pacemakers, just in case that was to happen.
Any other questions on the floor?
Yeah.
So as I think as a moderator, I'd like to reserve the privilege to do a public poll for the topic, because the topic is risk-sharing agreement between payers and health industries, and whether it is true that a solution to facilitate market access to innovation treatment. I'd like everyone to raise up your hand whether you think this is, you believe this is a solution to facilitate access to innovative treatment. For those who believe this is, this is a solution to facilitate access to innovation treatment, please raise your hand.
Say yes.
So for those who believe risk-sharing agreements will be the solution to facilitate access to innovative treatment, please raise your hand.
He's not making you define the risk. The risk to me is lower ASPs in my job.
Sure.
Okay. So can I assume the rest will be, will think that this will not be the solution to facilitate access to innovative treatment? Yeah, we have a. Thank you for raising up your hand.
But it is one solution. It's not the solution.
I guess the absolute solution for me is what's a little bit not sitting well with me. So I think it's a very complex thing. Healthcare is a very complex thing. And to minimize it to this as the solution for me is a little bit of a stretch. And I think also the idea of access, I mean, unfortunately on both sides, the definition is a little bit different. I mean, on one side, it means what it really means, is that you reach certain patients. But on the other side, there is a dollar figure attached to that. So even that part of it, I think, of the definition, kind of a little bit shaky for me. I mean, what do we really mean by access? So I think to simplify that this is the solution is I think, a stretch. And I think that there will be a constant search for solutions. And this is just probably one of them. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. But it's not the solution.
It's a solution, not the solution.
It's one of them.
It's one solution, yeah.
I think it's one solution aimed at maybe affordability as the barrier, or one solution. I mean, this isn't anywhere near the spectrum of tentacles that come off of it.
We can take an example. I was in Korea before. In Korea, you have the fastest aging population in the world. The government is the single payer. They keep very low prices. If you take all the medicines available in OECD, 60% of those treatments are not available in South Korea because you always go to very low comparators, and then most of the innovative products are not available. So there is no recognition for innovation. So I think in those kind of markets, we should recognize that, of course, government is faced with a tough situation, and we should be flexible. In some markets where maybe you don't have fast aging population, and I think there are other ways. So I would tend to agree. It's one of the solutions. It depends on the market. It depends on how we can shape win-win solutions. But obviously, in this market, it's not normal that 60% of innovative treatments are not available for the population. So that's a fact.
I think actually I do think it's one solution, but one of the issues I think I think I totally subscribe to what you say, but one of the solution is related today to the way the overall pricing around drugs is done around the world, with a vicious circle, I would say. Vicious circle, which is the reference pricing, international reference pricing. It's a vicious circle because companies fight and strive to get a high facial price in wealthy countries, where those wealthy countries have a lot of buying power, so they can negotiate discounts which are confidential. And basically, which leads to eventually setting high reference price for low-income countries. And with extreme situations where Korea will not accept to pay for high prices. I think the overall international reference pricing for companies through globalization leads to totally absurd situation where I think I'm not going to talk about risk sharing, but I think that there should be more price discrimination according to capacity to pay, not willingness to pay around the world. And if we had that, we would avoid the situations that Eric was mentioning. But companies do not want to move away from that because they're facing this reference pricing, and everybody's penalized finally, because you may come to the situation where countries like France and UK, because they have secret discount agreements, not risk sharing, secret discount agreements with companies, basically may have more affordable prices than lower income countries around the world. I think that's one of the major issues today. It's not risk sharing. Risk sharing, I do think definitely that you can only talk about risk sharing in very specific situations that Dhinagar has mentioned, is that when definitely you have high legitimate uncertainty on a new treatment because you're triggering things that you don't really know about it, and before you want to sort of open accessibility to everybody, you really need to do some more investment. And here the risk sharing is here in the deal that the company is going to make with the payer, saying, look, we have enough data that we think that this product is worthwhile for your patients. Are you ready to take the risk? And you believe that, so are you ready to take the risk with us that we put that on the market so that we can generate cash? But we're ready to share the risk through eventually investing more money in providing with the information so that we come to better knowledge on how the drug works. This is a true win-win situation. This is the only case where I think where risk sharing is totally legitimate, actually, from my perspective.
This example,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead, George.
This example you gave of Korea is relevant to everybody here because from a business perspective, this is the most innovative, suppressive system possible. You're first to market, you get X, and X isn't enough to actually substantiate what you're doing. You fast follower, you get a little bit less, a little bit less. Right? Everybody here knows the highest reimbursing country in the world is Japan. It's right next door. Every 2 years, Japan does FAP, foreign average pricing. We would lose more money collectively ever having a low price right next door if they treated all 52 million people, all right, by entering into the company. So now you're seeing Korea, 6th or 7th largest economy in the world, a developed country. Again, we have Seoul, but that really doesn't have the quality of care from companies like us, nor will it, because of the risk of their neighbor right next door. They could never give us the volumes to offset that. So what do? Take our ball and go away. I mean, that's exactly what happens.
Well, the other thing that happens is otherwise you do Korea. So most other companies end up doing a very internal localized strategy, which again means that the capability of the industry doesn't really improve. So if you've got a drug which is registered, you don't want to supply an improved version from another part of the world simply because you can't even register it. You will not get a price.
One of the 13 countries in the world that makes me give them 50 working models of any product I want to register, where are those going, right? And now they're a completely competent in-country to develop the same product, right? I mean, they don't take my IP, they make me give it to them before they give me regulatory approval so that they can give me no price. I mean, and this is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a great example of the reason I did.
Any follow-up comments? In that situation, then what would you do in terms of risk sharing? I guess it's really a basic issue still of, I mean, I'm not sure risk sharing is the solution for the situations we described actually, or a solution. But I think maybe when we move to a certain level where we have actually resolved the issue of pricing, for example, then maybe it becomes a more relevant, more relevant solution for improving access. Anyway, maybe it's specific to the market or markets, the emerging markets.
You're right, but one of the key issues is about price. But I think that international reference pricing is really the easy and most, I would say, non-relevant solution you can have in the region. Because the alternative to international reference pricing is to really put in place the way to assess the value of drugs or medical devices, and eventually, in some cases, to find solutions to facilitate access. And risk sharing can be one solution. But to do that, it means that governments have to make a big effort. First, they need to integrate that there are alternatives to international reference pricing, which is really not really meaningful from an economic perspective, especially in this region, I think, given the differences between the countries and so on and so forth. And second, so that you need to have a political will, and you need to need some expertise and some tools, information, blah, blah, blah. So it's a whole process to get out from that. And in some cases, risk sharing can be one of the solution in some exceptional cases. But there are other ways to regulate that international reference pricing, which has no sense. Even in Europe, it's becoming absurd to some extent.
Yeah.
So I think I appreciate the comment. I actually wasn't suggesting international reference pricing either, but there was a suggestion earlier, I think, from Gérard on like a tiered or socialized pricing. For me, that might be a more relevant option.
Sure. But difficult to implement.
Any other questions? So I think it's already nice. We don't want to share the risks of you coming back late. So I hope this public talk will be very interesting, and it's interesting and it's natural for you. And we hope we look forward to your coming back for our second public talk in June. And before we end this session, please join us to give the big applause for our three speakers: Gérard, Prof, and Dhinagar. Thank you for giving us so much insight on this topic. And please feel free to never our speakers. Thank you.